Second. Jonathan,
Joe, how are you, man?
what's up, man? How you doing?
Man, I'm doing fantastic, and I have to say, I've really enjoyed listening to your interviews because you ask fantastic questions, and I'm probably going to go and listen to more of them
Oh,
to
cool,
get
man.
to draw from. I do an interview style podcast as well, and I'm gonna like you ask some really thoughtful questions that I would love to ask people as well. So I'm gonna learn from you.
Well, I appreciate that. And I've always been in journalism, but I'll tell you the moment where I really thought if I had to put my feet to the fire, and this actually happened. Back in my 20s, we used to all hook up at a coffee shop. I'm in a Kansas City. I'm in Kansas City now, but I was in a suburb called Liberty. And we'd all sit around, and a friend of mine came to me and said, there was some people that drove to Kurt Vonnegut's front doorstep to have coffee and cigarettes with him. And they came up with these questions. What would be your five questions? And I've always thought about that. Like if I only had a certain amount of questions for people, like you really got to get in there and fight the good fight. So I've always really kind of thought about that, and that's been the bee in my proverbial bonnet. So no, I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to digging into your life. And I love the ocean scene back there. It's awesome.
Yeah, I wish it was real. I'd like to tell people I have the secret location in Alberta, Canada, where I'm from, where there's some ocean, but
Yeah.
we have to settle for the gorgeous Rocky Mountains in our backyard instead.
Well, I we can't even do that here. I mean, we don't have. I mean, I'm in the middle of America, so everything's kind of man-made and it's just flat. So at
Yeah,
least
yeah,
we
the
got
prairies.
texture. What's
Like
that?
it's like our prairies here. So
Yeah.
to east is like flat. Like if I start driving east, it's flat for like probably the same thing until you get through northern Ontario and you get like above Michigan and whatnot. So because I guess you'd probably hit the Appalachians if you go east eventually, and then you hit the Rockies when you go west. But between there is just like a plateau of sorts.
I think it used to be an ocean, especially like I'm in the Missouri side, but in Kansas, it just was a big ocean. So, um, I guess that's our only oceanic claim to fame, so to speak, really,
Yeah.
you
Now,
know.
looking at your background there, it looks as though that's a shape of the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, that's my logo for the show. Yeah.
Amazing. And that little blue tip there is like Ontario.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I actually painted that about a year ago, and it was just supposed to be an outline of the United States, and my wife saw it and was like, "Oh man, I have to have that for my class." She's a fifth grade teacher.
Okay.
So I just got into rebranding and I'm like, I think that works. So I just kind of went with it. So
That's,
that's
that's fabulous.
yeah, so that's how we arrived at today. But I got to tell you up front, I love the Canadians, and I love that you have socialized healthcare. I love talking to musicians because the government always gives money. There's and even after the big gun incident in America with New Mexico last year, Trudeau responded and started rolling back things about guns. You guys always respond, but it happens in America and we don't respond. It's weird. It's like I just I always admire the Canadian spirit, and there's so many things that you do that's logical and makes sense to me.
I would agree. There's a lot of U.S. cities I wouldn't want to live in. Um, and look, if I lived in the U.S., I've definitely owned a gun.
Right.
like,
It,
um, now, and the one thing that's sort of like I think we're seeing an upsurge in like knife crime, and
wow.
it's there's something kind of troubling about it because it's happening a lot in like public transit. It's happening in the bigger cities. I live in a smaller city, thankfully,
Yeah.
um, but it's not a lot you can do about that.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I say there's not a lot. Here's what I think the real problem is. The real problem is the untreated mental health crisis that we are suffering with to a massive degree, just not just in like Canada or the U.S., but like around the world for so many different reasons. That'd be like a whole another whole
Right.
other bomb to open up. But I mean, I think we should normalize therapy, and until we do, we're going to continue to see these sorts of issues.
Well, and that's a part of what we're going to get into with your life, dealing with emotions and dealing with, the kind of
Mm.
the mental state of us. And before we get into that, one of the biggest determinants of that in our modern world has been COVID. How did you survive that 3-year period, and how has it changed the way that you do things now?
Well, I was actually really fortunate. Call us fortunate. I had a bricks and mortar nutrition and supplement store, and that business failed 2 years before COVID. That left me basically in financial ruin with a mountain of debt. And so I had to decide, well, what am I going to do with this? And I felt like I just couldn't go back to being an employee. I have an entrepreneurial spirit, and this isn't to knock anyone who's an employee. Very few people are really genuinely cut out to survive entrepreneurship. It's up and down. It's like hard. But I launched my own like online nutrition coaching business. It was like I know this is what I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about connecting with people, and so I kind of started with a social media account and telling people, hey, this is what I do. So by the time COVID rolled around, I've been working from home for 2 years, and we were really fortunate. My wife was able to go was on mat leave, and my son was born. It was this really interesting bubble where, like, and my son was born during the pandemic. We were like this little 3-person family unit living in our house, and we got a ton of time with my little boy. It was so amazing, incredible. My wife is from Australia. We just came back from 2 months in Australia. We hadn't been back for 4 years, and so she hadn't seen her family for 4 years. But we had like a group WhatsApp call every week with her family, and we probably communicated more with her family when we weren't able to travel, because we're like, boy, we really need to be in touch with each other, because normally we'd go back to Australia every year. And so I didn't get laid off. My wife was on mat leave, and so I was incredibly fortunate, really.
Yeah, that's wonderful, man. So let's get to the essence of what you do. I want to put you
Mm.
in front of a bunch of grade school kids, third graders. Okay. So one of them looks up and says, what do you do for a living? How do you answer that child?
And I heard you ask this question in the previous interview, and I was like, darn, he's going to ask me that question.
That's right.
I I help people understand themselves better. Now that seems like a really interesting answer for a nutrition coach, but we we do things and we often don't understand why we do it, and we do things that hurt ourselves and we don't understand why we do it. Well, I help people to understand why they do that, so we can change their behavior and they can be healthier.
It makes total sense to me. As someone that's tried to maintain weight and do healthier things, there's a lot of food that we eat that comes from different
Mm,
emotional places in us. We just don't need that much,
yeah.
and we need it in better quantities.
Just before this, I was speaking with a client of mine, and we talked about how, so one of the tools we might use is calorie counting, for example, and it's debated thing, a bit debated tool, but essentially, if we only ever ate unprocessed whole foods, we wouldn't have to ever do that. But processed foods are made in a way that bypasses our brain's regulation mechanism, essentially. So we really can't calculate or understand how much we're eating. But it's incredible. In Canada, we have these little donuts called Timbits, donut holes. And they're like
Yeah.
100 calories each. You could eat 10 of them and it feels like you're barely scraping the bottom of your stomach, and you've eaten 1,000 calories.
Yeah.
Like, boom, that's like half of someone's daily intake. And you don't even feel like you've scratched the surface of eating. And that's the world that we live in. Like, so and we live in, and just to sort of tie it up, we also live in a very emotionally stressful world, very different than our grandparents or great grandparents and so on. But the age of digital technology, it's amazing. Look at us chatting like this today. But it's
Yeah.
also, it gives us access to unprecedented and even overwhelming levels of information, and overwhelmingly negative information, which
Yeah.
creates a level of emotional stress we haven't seen before. Well, one of our emotional anesthetics is food, the others being alcohol, drugs, video games, pornography, all these other vices that we might have, but I call them emotional anesthetics.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right. So your backstory is crazy. You almost got murdered,
Yeah.
there's all of these things, but let's go back to where you were born and raised and these seeds that were planted in you, because you're not just
Yeah.
going into a job and doing your thing and getting a paycheck. You're emotionally helping people. How did these seeds get into you to grow into who you are?
Well, this is really fascinating. I was born at 26 weeks. I was an accident in multiple senses of the word. I was a failure of 1980s birth control. My parents were hoping for a daughter because they already had a son, and so I was an unexpected pregnancy, and I came at 26 weeks, and I wasn't expected to live. So I spent the first 9 weeks of my life on life support in a neonatal intensive care unit. Now, that's a really interesting background, because when we think about a child, normally a child spends so much time in the first days of their lives in skin to skin contact with their mother. That didn't happen for me. It wasn't possible. Now, the nurses, they liked me and they would have come and so on, but I didn't get that level of attention. What that actually fostered was this really interesting level, probably for my parents, sometimes frustrating level of independence, where I was always trying to do things without their help. I wanted to figure out how it worked. I wanted to do it myself. And they would just sometimes throw their hands up in despair and be like, all right, kid, you're determined to do this the hard way. I'm going to let you do it the hard way. But that seemed to be this lay the foundation. I mean, my parents, they're loving parents. They're still together 44 years later. They now just live around the block from us, which is amazing. but that was really what laid the seeds for me. Like I struggled to be an employee because I'm far too stubborn and like independent minded to really stick within the confines of traditional employment.
Yeah. You know what's interesting about that story that you just said right there? So when the pandemic happened, I have a jazz radio show and I ramped
Mm,
up a lot of my interviews. And I was going after a lot of people that typically wouldn't be able to interview, like legends. Like it was the time
yeah,
to shine. So
amazing.
yeah, so I got on the phone with a legend. Her name is Diane Schur, and she's partially blind.
Mm,
And she's in her home, and I think her cat had a weird, I can't remember the cat's name, but the cat kept coming up to the phone and she kept apologizing. I said, look, it's the pandemic. Birds and airplanes and anything that come in here is all fair game. We're fine. So she's percolating coffee, waking up, and I said, how are you doing? We were about 4 weeks into this, maybe 5 weeks. We didn't know what was going on. The beginning of the pandemic,
mm, mm.
it was around spring break in the States, and we're all like, yeah, when this is over with, maybe a week after that, we'll get back to it. It was unprecedented. So I'm asking her, how are you doing? And she lived alone, and she said, I right now feel like the way I felt when I was born. She was born
Mm.
prematurely, and back in the day, that she was in kind of a tube, so to speak, and the oxygen was so heavy, that's what degenerated her eyesight. But when she told me she felt like she did
Mm.
when she was a baby, I of all of the comments that I got from people, and there was some fantastic things going on. Cats that moved from New York to Costa Rica, packed it all up and left, and
Yeah.
just amazing stories. But when she told me that story, it's just like you're talking about, like what that did for you, and ultimately what it did for her. It gave her probably a level of fight, and because she didn't have the eyesight that she maybe would have had if she wasn't incubated in that
Mm,
level of
mhm.
oxygen. So anyway, when you said that, it immediately came to mind. It was fascinating.
Well, interestingly enough, I was almost legally blind. I had thankfully, I was able to get corrective eye surgery.
Yeah.
And now I probably just a little bit less than 2020. After years later, it sort of degenerates a little bit, but I mean, I don't need glasses. And so, but as a kid, I had to have these Coke bottle glasses, like Hubble telescope coming attraction, like, and
Yeah.
oh man, kids are merciless.
Oh man, they're awful. Yeah. So speaking of kids, we're going to come back around. When you were in the third grade, what was your dream growing up? What'd you want to be?
Oh, I thought I wanted to be a chef, actually.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
and my parents, to their credit, actually fostered that. So they got me into the kitchen, got me learning how to cook and learning how to do recipes. We were cooking from I think there's like Jean Perret Company's Coming cookbook series. Anyone from like a child of, I don't know, the 40s or 50s or 60s, they might know the cookbooks I'm talking, the old school. And so they got me into that. And then it turned out by the time I was about 14, I was like, I don't like cooking anymore,
Yeah.
and I want to do something different. I wanted to be like a pro athlete. But yeah, I wanted to be a chef.
Yeah, I never ever really was taught how to cook. We were kind of the product of pop culture 80s, TV dinners, and all of that standard stuff. And I had a girlfriend at one point that said, you will never forget me because I'm going to teach you how to cook. And the
Mm.
key that I got out of that is don't be afraid to add ingredients and spices and
Oh
get as
man,
dirty as you can. Just destroy that kitchen.
my wife is like the queen of like destroying the kitchen and creating something amazing. Like where I'm quite minimalist, and so I cook and I do it's a lot of bachelor style cooking. But I'm like, if I can fit it all into one pot and make it taste good, like I'm game. Like
Yeah,
that.
that's it.
That's yeah. Until it comes to cooking steak, man, I want to be I'm very fastidious about how I would cook a steak.
Absolutely. Well, I've learned recently that I really enjoy leftover mishmashes. And I don't even
Yeah.
want to tell you what I just did for lunch today because people would be scratching their head, but it was tasty. It was like broccoli soup, some butter noodle pasta, and some breaded chicken, and it just all came together
Oh
and
man.
worked. So,
I'm like a breakfast rebel, I call myself.
yeah.
And so I eat things people, you eat that for breakfast? I'm like, why not? We eat it other times a day. Like the
Uh-huh.
concept of breakfast foods it's like only maybe 150 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like before that, so because my brother lives in Turkey, and so they're a much older culture than we are. And you go to the Mediterranean and you go to have breakfast, and yes, there's bread there, but there's like slices of cheese, there's slices of meat, there's like peppers and tomatoes and cucumbers and onions. Like that's their breakfast. It's not
Yeah.
this sugar laden cereal.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's weird too with Chinese food. I've heard
Mm.
that when you go to China, what we do here for Chinese food is not accurate.
No, not even close. But it's the same. You look at like Indian food. Well, we get primarily Indian food, or we would call East Indian food, I guess, to differentiate. But you primarily get food that we cooked like in the Punjab region. But India is like this incredible diaspora of cultures and countries. Like it's like 100 countries packed into one. And so the difference that you get, and same with Italian. Like I lived in Italy for 7 months, and north to south, man, it is totally different. So the thing that we think is Italian food is laughable to them.
I was just telling somebody today we were talking about 9/11, and I was in the back of a water taxi in Venice, Italy on 9/11.
Okay.
And I had a fight to get back home, and because my flight to Paris didn't exist anymore. It was a long story, but I remember I went to visit a pen pal, and when I went over there, they were just howling at the book I had because we didn't have smartphones. I had a book,
Right.
all of the terms. They grabbed that thing and they're like, oh, they were crying looking at this thing. And then like the second night, her dad, I'm sitting there eating my food and he just couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't really speak English and he just slammed his silverware down and he said, "Aspette." And he just said, just look at me. And he grabbed his silverware and he started twisting it and he said, there you go. And I always admired that he did that because he couldn't watch it anymore. I'm
Yeah.
fumbling, things are flying. It was bad.
The what I loved about living in Italy, because you probably with a name like Dimino, I'm guessing maybe you do have some Italian heritage.
Full blooded. That's what he was thinking. He was like, this kid, his dad's full blooded Italian from Brooklyn. Why is he eating pasta like this?
Right, right. That's just it. So I was a hit over in Italy. Weirdly, I'm like a ginger bearded. For those who are listening, I'm like ginger bearded blonde guy. But I was a hit in Italy because I have such a love for food, and
Yeah.
so I had such appreciation because they would want when we're over there, they want to prepare like the local dishes. So there's this amazing dish that almost nobody over here knows about called pizzoccheri,
Yeah.
and and if you ever want to have a really like heart attack in a dish, but it's so like hearty and satisfying and filling, learn how to make pizzoccheri. And they normally only make it in the winter because it's made with like butter and heavy cream and cheese, and it's just I don't it's incredible. Like imagine melting a pound of butter and pouring that hot butter over this pasta dish that has layers of noodles and cheese, and the hot butter melts the cheese. And
Wow.
oh, it is just I'm already like salivating thinking about it. But they made it for me in the summertime because like we want you to experience this. We want you to know, we know how much you love food. And I was a little bit bigger at the time as well. And of course they're always like, "Ah, hey, you're a growing boy." I'm like, "I'm 30 years old. I'm not actually."
Right. That's their thing. That's what happens in Italian families. They're like, "Are you full?" Yeah. Well, you got a little room. That's
Oh
what they
yeah.
say.
And the other thing is just how they would eat in like courses.
Yes.
Like the thought of mixing pasta with meat, like we don't do that. What are you
No.
insane? No, 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 no.
No.
You have like the antipasti comes first, and then like the salad comes, and maybe the noodles come, and then comes like a tray with like some meats and cheeses, and then you have a little bit of gelato, and they take their time with their meals.
Absolutely.
Oh, it's an experience. So, because we were like running English camps over there, so that's kind of I was a supervisor coordinating a whole bunch of English camps, and so then I would get put up in like host families from place to place all over Italy, which it was just incredible. It was like living the dream, and all
Yeah.
these Italian mamas who just like loved like cook, and I loved to eat food. I probably gained weight over there too, but I got to experience so much of like the real Italian culture versus like
Yeah.
kind of what we imagine over here. And I would say I've been to 45 countries, and Italy and Iceland would be the top of my list. Italy for its culture and Iceland for its landscape.
Yeah. My best friend, my son, Miles, his godfather, went to Iceland to see the Northern Lights last November. And man, he showed me shots from over there and
Mm.
just yeah, it was pretty cool.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's thankfully we live far enough north that we don't see them regularly, but like probably a couple times a year we get to see them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
They're
it's quite something. Like the sky, like it's like this shimmering green light in the sky. Like it doesn't even make sense. It's
crazy.
it's just gorgeous.
It happened accidentally here about a month and a half ago, and
That's right.
people didn't even know about it. And I'm like, I always miss that. I always miss the really good earth events. Like there was a
Yeah.
earthquake in Oklahoma years ago, and I was asleep. There's all these things that happen, and I just like I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay. So, just a little bit less than a year from the date of recording this, so April 2024, maybe like April 15th or 16th, there is going to be I think it's a total lunar eclipse, so middle of the day where the moon passes in front of the sun and blocks the sun out from the earth, and it'll last for
Yes.
about 4 minutes. I've already put that on my calendar because I didn't know what was going to happen. So I literally booked the day off
Yeah.
because it's something that it's a rather unique event in history. And I'm like, dang it, it's a Monday, I think. And I'm like, I am going to observe this. And I actually came across this article. It was like, here's what you don't do during the eclipse. Don't pull out your phone and take photos. This
Right.
is There are professional photographers that will capture this. You spend the 268 seconds or however long it lasts just enjoying this.
Yeah.
And you can even get like the special glasses that you can wear that will allow you to look at it. I'm like, that's totally what I'm doing.
That happened here in 17, I believe, and all of the kids got into it. I remember my son got glasses and it was a big deal. And yeah, that's cool, man. That's very cool. Um, man, I totally lost track. There was something I was gonna say and I lost track, but I'm gonna get back on it. So
Yeah,
what I want to know from you now is somebody that's obviously highly driven. Who's been a role model or hero for you in your life?
this is going to be an interesting answer, but it's a coach that I had about 6 years ago, and I think he really transformed. Like obviously I did the work, but his guidance was responsible for a really significant personal transformation in my life, and it really illustrated for me the power of coaching. His name is Scott, and Scott doesn't like to any kind of attention or anything like that. He just quietly goes about his business. But what he did for me was, one, he didn't give up on me. So I was in this place where I was really struggling with my mental health. I was quite overweight. I really hated myself and who I had become, and I didn't know how to get myself out of it. And so when I started to hire him, 'cause originally I thought I was hiring a coach to lose weight, he showed me a level of compassion that I'd never experienced before, especially from another man. I didn't know, or maybe what I thought compassion was like sort of the soft, weak kind of thing, and I would have entirely rejected it. He modeled self compassion and compassion for me, and because of that, it's like why I do what I do today. And so, and I've actually never met him in person, but every year I just touch base with him and I just thank him for the work that he did. And he's very humble. He's worked with probably thousands of people, but that really shone a light for me. And like, this is the power of a genuine, like one-to-one human interaction that one person can have with another person and show them a different perspective and really create transformation in their life.
Yeah, that's great. So based on that and just what you do, what's a daily motivator? What really gets you out of bed and pulls you through a day?
It's funny. What gets me out of bed is my 2-year-old.
Right.
Now,
As it should.
legitimately, because he data get up.
Yep.
But every day, so every morning, we have what we call like morning snuggle time, and that is, a little fella climbs into bed with us, and my wife's expecting number two at this point, and we have some cuddles and some tickles and whatever. That time is about connecting with the two, soon to be three most important people in my life, and reminding me like anything that I do not want to lose sight of who I'm doing it for and why I'm doing it. And then we have breakfast together. So we have just a standard bowl of oatmeal with blueberries because my kid, he calls them boobies, but he loves blueberries. Oh, kids are amazing.
Yeah.
Um, but that's really what gets me out of bed. You would think maybe it's this big, lofty sort of aspirational goal. And I mean, I have some big goals, but really at the heart of it is these people that I love more than like anybody else in this world. And this is who I'm doing it for. And it's so important that I don't, because you're right, I'm very driven. I could be a workaholic, and I have to remind myself every day, this is who I'm doing this for. Don't lose sight of that.
Yeah. So if you can meet anybody alive right now on the planet, who would it be? Who would you spend time with?
And I was like, I bet you're going to ask this question. Here's, I'm not a big, like famous person,
I
so to
get
speak.
that. Sure.
But I would really enjoy spending some time with Andrew Yang.
Okay. I've heard that
Now,
before.
yeah, because I feel like I don't know the guy, of course, but I feel like it would be really interesting to sit down and talk to him because he has some unique ideas politically. So he's been successful in business. I believe he's a billionaire, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Um, he's created his own political party because he doesn't see in the sort of bipolar political paradigm that you have in the US
Yeah.
a feasible solution. And so I would love to spend some time just sitting with him chatting about his ideas politically and how he sees that as a possibility. And like I said, I respect him because he's been successful in business, and so he understands what it takes to be profitable. And I think governments are immensely wasteful, and so I'd love to just get an hour to hang out with him and pick his brain.
So speaking of a successful person like that, what are you the proudest of that you've done in your life up to this point?
I'm going to say being a father, because I was thinking about this one as well, and maybe before I was a dad, I would have said something like I've been to 45 countries, I lived in
Yeah.
7 countries, I learned to speak 5 languages, all these sort of like accomplishments. But because of the work that I go back to the work that I did with this coach Scott before I was ever a dad, it's actually enabled me to be a very different father than I would have been, where I'm again much more patient, much more compassionate, curious, and present. And I recognize like parenthood is this beautiful thing. Like it's challenging as well. You know, gosh, the kid wakes you up halfway through the night and you're like, just go to sleep, please. Like, but there's something about like, and I watch my wife and as a mother, but there's something about being a parent that it's like we are shaping future human beings. Now his personality is like already predetermined. We're born with like 200 personality traits. They're already like locked in.
Yeah,
But I get to help shape and mold that. And I now have this level of awareness and understanding that I didn't used to have that's allowing me to be a very different father than I would have been.
absolutely. So in the realm of art, what was a book or an album or artwork that really swayed you in your life that just opened you up in a different way?
This might be a funny one.
Uh,
In 1998, I was living in small town BC, British Columbia, north of Washington State. And I was listening to the radio as you did back then because we didn't have the internet or we had a very poor version of it. And this song came on and I didn't understand it. It was the song Du Hast by Rammstein. And it was like music as like I'd never heard before. Like I obviously I'd heard of rock, I'd heard metal and things like that, but this was like a different kind of sound and got me awfully curious about it. And what's really fascinating is this group of people might just look at them as like, I don't know, these sort of over the top theatrical like metal group, but they're actually very, very carefully calculated and artistic in what they do. And they use that form of music as a medium. And so it really showed to me like a different perspective on a genre like metal that might sometimes be dismissed by people as just, the cacophony of noise. And I'm like, this is actually a really fascinating sort of artistic presentation. I'm so glad that they stay true and sing in German. The language really fits their music. They made a song like one or two songs in English and they can speak English, but I'm glad that they stayed to that. So for me, I actually really enjoyed that, which is funny because I played jazz trumpet in high school, like
yeah,
totally
no,
unrelated.
yeah, that's great. And that's the beauty of life is the all the flavors that go in to add up to who we are, which leads me naturally into my next question. Everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, clients, colleagues, but you live your life. What's your
Mm.
perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I have two core values that I really try to live by, and I don't do it perfectly, but I would say I'm a like compassion and integrity. Those are the two that everything else that I do, I really that's my like measuring stick, if you will. So I try not to measure myself by the opinions of others, but rather by these values that really don't change. And so I see myself as like a kind of like a compassionate engineer. So I have this really unique brain that I got free of charge and I can't take the credit for. But like my dad has like an encyclopedic memory and my mother is incredibly creative artistically. And I kind of got the two melded together.
Yeah,
And it's this was and for many, many years, I didn't know that I had a unique brain. Like I mean, everybody does to some degree, but I was not even self-aware enough to realize like my brain works very differently than most people's.
yeah.
And and when I did learn it, like I learned to sort of hide these things because kids would make fun of me. Because in school, like I didn't ever have to study. I just went and wrote tests. And I didn't know that like, oh, this is supposed to be hard. Like I would just show up and do it. And I didn't understand like why doesn't everybody just do this?
Yeah.
So for most of my life, I'd learned to hide that because kids would have made fun of me. They picked on me, all this kind of stuff. And it took until again, I go back to working with Scott for me to really start to appreciate like, wow, I really do have this unique ability. And so now as a coach, especially, I think I want to help people like uncover their unique gifts. And so they get to appreciate themselves in a different way as well. So I'm finally at this place where I'm at comfort, like I'm at peace with who I am, and I actually like appreciate and value the gifts that I have to offer.
And speaking of those gifts you've offered, what's been the best client success story you've ever had?
Well, I was thinking about this one lady, and I think she lives in is there a town near you, something hill, right near Kansas, Missouri border?
Oh, Mission Hills?
Maybe it's somewhere right in around there. Like she lives down there, and I don't want to name her in case she hears this.
Right.
She's very humble,
Yeah.
but she came to me, 60 years old, and tried, 40 years of struggling with her weight and all this kind of stuff, and just like crazy backstory in terms of how she got to where she is, and almost kind of wanting to give up. And somehow she came across oh no, it was her daughter found some piece of content and shared it with her mom and said, "You need to talk to this guy." So something I'd shared. She reached out. We worked together for probably 18 months, but in the first 8 months, she lost about 50 pounds.
Wow.
And now, but for her, she's only 5 feet tall. that is like a really, really significant result.
Yeah.
Now, she did this while caring for a mother who has dementia and a husband with a heart condition and a daughter. And I don't want to list too many other family details, but under very difficult circumstances while working full time. And so that showed to me where I might have dismissed in the past the potential that maybe someone has. And now I have a bunch of clients in their 60s and I love it. I'm like, this is so exciting that people aren't giving up and just rolling down the other side of the hill when they're over the hill. They're
Yeah.
saying there's still more life I want to live. And so, crazy thing is, more of my clients are like professional women in their 50s and 60s than like I never thought that's who I'd end up working with. And yet that seems to be who I work with.
Yeah. That's wonderful, man. So speaking of clients, if
Hmm.
anyone out there wants to hire you, learn more about you, where can they go?
Freedomnutritioncoach.com would be the website, and you can learn a little bit more about what I do. In a nutshell, for the adults who aren't third graders, I say I try to marry the science of metabolism with the psychology of behavior change and the compassion of human connection to create life-changing transformations in people.
Wonderful, man. Jonathan, this has been great. Thank you for opening up. It was wonderful to meet you, man. Best of luck with everything.
Thank you, man. It's truly been a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care.